It's Kat, and I'm back because what once was will be again. We are going to use history and a little legend to divine some mysteries of the Game of Thrones. And in this segment, we're going to continue to talk about this idea of the Princes in the Tower because it is a pivotal moment in history. And as tragic and terrible as it is, without it, there had been no breaking of the will and no coming of the dawn. And so Mr. Martin has included this storyline at least 3 times in his story of A Song of Ice and Fire. You can go check the other 2 storylines that include the murder of the Princess in the Tower from previous videos. First one would be Who are the Tyrells in history? Because in history, it is one Sir James Tyrell who is later confesses to complicit in the murder of the Princess in the Tower. And in the second one, we talk about Aegon the Pretender, because in history, since there were no bodies and there was no funeral, thereafter pretenders came out of the woodwork trying to claim the throne, which is exactly what's happening in our story of A Song of Ice and Fire with Aegon the Pretender. The storyline we're going to follow this time is the storyline of the Starks, including Bran and Rickon, because this storyline actually most closely follows the actual storyline of the murder of the Princess in the Tower. And in case you don't know who the princes in the Tower were in history, Edward IV, who was Edward of York, was the King of England, and he died leaving 2 young princes as the heirs to the throne. He left his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as their protector, and he was supposed to get the eldest one crowned and placed on the throne as Edward V. But instead, Richard, the Duke of York, captured the 2 princes, put them in the Tower, had them declared bastards, had himself crowned the King of England as Richard III, and then the 2 princes disappear into history. At that point, rumor had begun that the princes were murdered. In our story of A Song of Ice and Fire, Catelyn Tully, who is the daughter of the Lord of Riverrun, ends up marrying Eddard Stark after Eddard's father and brother are killed by Mad King Aerys. Now in history, Edward of York, who becomes Edward IV of England, his father and one of his brothers was indeed killed prior to him taking the throne, and it's what drove him to take the throne. And then a couple years later, he ends up meeting Elizabeth Woodville, who is the daughter of Baron Rivers, and she's very beautiful, and he falls in love with her and he marries her, and they end up having 5 children. Now in history, their 5 children are actually, the 5 surviving children are 3 daughters and 2 sons. Here we have the Starks with 3 sons and 2 daughters. And as you know, Ned is beheaded, very similar to how actually Edward, Duke of York's father was beheaded before he took the throne. And Catelyn Stark dies along with her eldest son, Robb. And while she was out with Robb, she had left her 2 boys, Bran and Rickon, at Winterfell along with some servants to run Winterfell, because there must always be a Stark at Winterfell. And you see Bran being taught how to govern, learn his history, things of that nature. And this is very similar to what happens in history, because at the time, right before Edward IV had died, his son, the eldest, Prince Edward, was in Wales, where he had been installed as the Prince of Wales, and he was learning things like government and being educated about history and how to be a warrior. Now in A Song of Ice and Fire, what is happening is that Robb sends Theon off to the Iron Islands, supposedly to make a deal in order to get some support, but instead what happens is that Theon goes to Winterfell and ends up taking Winterfell. In history, when Edward IV died, Richard, Duke of York, supposedly under the direction and or the last will and testament of his brother, making him the protector, goes to get Edward IV, or Edward V, his son, from Wales. And he intercepts him along with most of his retainers. And these retainers and counselors he has sent off to a castle where they are summarily beheaded. And of course, we see in our story of A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, that Theon has Sir Roderick summarily beheaded. And then at this point, one of his henchmen is urging him to kill the two princes, Bran and Rickon, because so long as they're alive, that they're the actual lords of Winterfell, and that they could instigate a rebellion or have some other thing going on. Although in the story of A Song of Ice and Fire, it is actually Ramsay who's urging Theon to do the murder. It's like Ramsay, aka Richard III. Of course, in history, once Richard has both of the princes in the tower, they do have all of their servants taken away from them. And then there's this discussion in history, and you could see it in Shakespeare's play of Richard III, about who actually orders the murder. Most believe that Richard III just ordered it directly. There's questions about what kind of discussion went on, who actually knew about it. So this is what we see in A Song of Ice and Fire, is where we are getting someone to urge somebody else to do it so that their hands are clean. Theon at this point has actually killed 2 peasants that nobody knows that they're not Bran and Rickon. He's displayed their bodies and said it's them and that they're dead. But Bran and Rickon, having gotten the wind that they might be murdered, had actually escaped. So this is where we get Mr. Martin playing around with some of the theories or legends that grew up around the princes in the tower. Did one or both of them escape? And then we see Ramsay supposedly coming in as a retainer or one of the sworn followers for the Starks, aka the Yorks, but instead he ends up taking Winterfell himself. Then Ramsay has himself declared the Lord of Winterfell and the Warden of the North, just like in history where Richard III supposedly was supposed to be the Lord Protector and ensuring that the 2 sons of Edward IV were safe and that one was crowned as king. Instead, he takes it for himself and has himself crowned King Richard III. In history, shortly after Richard III takes the crown, his one and only son dies, and then so does his wife. And this leads to many rumors that he actually had her killed. And we see this in our story of A Game of Thrones, where Ramsay has Walda, Fat Walda, and the baby killed by his hounds. And in history at this point, Richard had convinced Elizabeth Woodville and her daughters to come out of sanctuary, and he brings Elizabeth of York to the court, and there begin some strange rumors that in fact he plans on marrying her. And these rumors actually begin before his wife even dies. And then as soon as she dies, these rumors become really rampant. Of course, this is very much like our story of A Song of Ice and Fire, because if the 2 princes in the tower are in fact dead, then Elizabeth of York, as the eldest daughter, is now the heir to the throne, and then her 2 sisters thereafter will become the heirs to the throne if she doesn't live. So as long as she lives, there is still a chance for rebellion. And in fact, because England doesn't do queens, that whoever marries her will by right of marriage be the King of England. So Richard was probably considering this in order to shore up his now shaky throne. Of course, in our story of A Song of Ice and Fire, Ramsay actually marries some pretender pretending to be Arya. But in the Game of Thrones, we actually see him marry Sansa. And he marries her for those exact same reasons. Because Bran and Rickon are dead, Jon Snow's a bastard, therefore Sansa is the next legitimate heir to Winterfell. In history, when the rumors were out that Richard planned to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, the Lords of the Realm became so scandalized, they demanded that he post a retraction. And so he had to stand up in front of Parliament and say he had never ever intended such a thing, and he has no idea who would start those rumors. And he ends up sending Elizabeth of York away to Sheriff Hutton, which is a castle that's under the nominal control of one of his men. Herein, some historians have posited a theory that Richard III never planned to marry Elizabeth of York. He was never going to be that terrible. It was just a ruse in order to convince Henry Tudor to come over and attack early, because by then he already had heard the rumors that Henry Tudor himself had vowed to marry Elizabeth of York once he'd taken the throne. In our story, Sansa escapes with Theon, and then she goes north where she finds Jon Snow at the wall. And while she's there, she's trying to convince Jon Snow that they should go and attack Winterfell. Although Jon Snow at this point seems a little bit reluctant until they get a letter in which Ramsay, aka Richard III, says, "I have your brother and I'll kill him. And then I'm going to take your sister after I kill you. And after I get done with her and she gives me an heir or 2, I'll probably kill her too." So here we should keep in mind that Mr. Martin doesn't just make one of his characters one person in history, but he likes to amalgamate some of the characters and make them have several of the parts, sort of like a Shakespearean play. And in history, right at this moment, what happens is Sansa begins to play Margaret Beaufort as well as Elizabeth of York. So who Margaret Beaufort is she is Henry Tudor's mother. And you can tell she is the Countess of Richmond, and their badge is the hound. So if you've seen the other videos where we talked about the Battle of the Bastards or Jon Snow as Henry Tudor, his badge as the Earl of Richmond is the hound. And you see that Sansa embroiders that on a dress. Now in history, Margaret Beaufort is actually married to Lord Stanley. And Lord Stanley at this point is nominally Richard's man, but really Lord Stanley in history is just like Littlefinger. He sways and bends with the wind, and he continues to survive no matter who's in charge. Both Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth of York begin to work on Lord Stanley, trying to convince him to support Henry Tudor. And here in our story of A Song of Ice and Fire, we get a scene that's straight out of history. Sansa goes secretly to meet Littlefinger at a closed-down tavern/brothel, and where Littlefinger is offering some support, but Sansa is accusing him of being a double-dealing dude, which is exactly who Lord Stanley was. And she didn't really trust him. And he says, well, your uncle has some forces for you maybe, but if you ever need me, let me know. A little bit later, as they're discussing their battle plans and they're trying to go around and convince all of these different little houses to support them, Sansa realizes that she's going to need Littlefinger's support, so she writes him a letter and she signs it Sansa Stark. Now, if you saw our video, The Battle of the Bastards, Who's Jon Snow, you would know that at this point, Margaret Beaufort and Henry Tudor are attempting to get some smaller houses, particularly in Wales, to come and join them, as well as convince a few of the disaffected Yorks to join them as well. With that scene straight out of history, Elizabeth of York is said, according to a song that was popularized shortly thereafter, to have met Lord Stanley in an inn that had been closed down specifically for the purpose of Elizabeth of York and Lord Stanley to meet. And this inn, of course, was a tavern/brothel. And there they discuss what is going to happen, but neither of them are ready to commit because Stanley, he blows in the wind and he's not sure what the deal is. And Elizabeth of York isn't 100% sure if she can trust Stanley because he is Richard's man and she thinks he might be telling him stories. But right at that moment, that's when Richard says he's not going to marry her and he has her sent off to Sheriff Hutton. So right before she's sent off, she writes Lord Stanley a message. Give this to Henry Tudor. Tell him to come and please support him because Elizabeth of York is probably pretty sure that she's going to disappear just like her brothers did. And she signs the letter, Elizabeth of York. Of course, in history, Henry Tudor couldn't be for 100% sure what was up with the princes in the tower. There was just rumors that they were dead. There were no bodies and no funeral. And so here we get Mr. Martin giving us the Shakespeare treatment where he has this imagined discussion between Elizabeth and Henry, and or Margaret Beaufort and Henry Tudor, where Sansa talks to Jon Snow and says, our brother is dead. Even if he's not dead yet, he will be dead because Ramsay cannot afford to let him live because he is the legitimate heir to Winterfell. Then in our story, of course, Ramsay, aka Richard III, does kill Rickon right before the Battle of the Bastards, which is the Battle of Bosworth. If you go catch our Battle of the Bastards Part 2, how that goes down. But in this story, Jon Snow, a.k.a. Henry Tudor, is just about to die when Littlefinger, a.k.a. Lord Stanley, sweeps in and saves the day. In history, Henry Tudor is proclaimed the King of England right on the battlefield, and shortly thereafter we see Jon Snow being proclaimed the King of the North. Now in history, Henry Tudor does marry Elizabeth of York, and we do have these interesting moments between Jon Snow and Sansa, and we now know that they're cousins, just like Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York were cousins. And Sansa bears a striking resemblance to this funeral effigy of Elizabeth of York. But Sansa also looks a lot like Elizabeth I, the princess that was promised. We still have Jon Snow and Daenerys to consider because we're still predicting that they have to get together because this starts into Arthurian legend. Not only does King Arthur have 3 swords, but he also marries 3 Guineveres. To wait and see how Mr. Martin with the Song of Ice and Fire or the Game of Thrones takes this story. Thank you very much. Hit the like button or leave a comment. We'll talk to you guys later.